Hello? It should be working, and if it's not, let me know. Oh gosh, that sun that is hitting me right now. Boop-a-doop. Boop-a-doop. Hi, Rourke, how are you? Hold on, I'm gonna tweet out this is happening. Cause, yes. I'm so live, I'm alive, I'm awake, which is frankly a miracle. Cause I've been sleepy. I feel pretty good. I'm just sleepy. I think part of it is actually the heat. It is, I don't know how hot here, but my room does not have air conditioning. So there is that happening in this world. How are you today, Rourke? Yeah, you did, but it is good. The Shadowrun game sounds interesting. Um, but I don't, I'm extremely lazy. All I do now is sleep, so out. Oh, I can't type and talk at the same time. Ba, ba, ba. Okay. Yeah. Um. I don't know if what chai, like, I know what chai is. I've never had chai in my life, I don't think, and part of that is because I think I'm afraid of the caffeine. We all play games we don't love, though, honestly. Like, I play games, um, I don't play games. I guess my equivalent would be, like, I read books I don't love, um, because of who I am as a person. So it's all good. I hope whatever game you play next is fun, more fun than this one was. Um, you said it was fun. It was just repetitive, and also there was hashtag stuff in it, which welcome to Shadowrun. Yeah, no, that's the thing is like stuff with chai. I'm like, oh no, I'm too dumb. Um, my caffeine tolerance is so freaking low. We'll just hang around and see. I'm looking at my room right now, which thank God you are not, because it's a nightmare. Um, because I haven't really unpacked since Tuesday when I moved back into my house, and uh, I just have bags of things, clothes on the ground. That's just where I live now. But I feel like one day I will pick up and start going because of who I am. Yeah, no, I keep this corner nice by not doing anything in it. Except keeping my books and sitting in it when I'm streaming. So the rest of it, it's surrounded by a small wall of books that you cannot see that I really should put away, but I'm very afraid I don't have the room for. So we'll figure it out at some point. Oh, I'm so sleepy. I'm not really that sleepy, I'm just hot. It's very good to sit in. Ooh, excuse me. It's 4:05 now, so I think we're going to get started, and folks who can trickle in, we can maybe hopefully catch them up a little bit. Complaining is a very fun game. I do two things in this world, and that's whine and yell. So, we're going to get started. I want to say right off the bat that what I'm talking about today obviously is not the full range of transgender experience, and it's not it's not that important for everyone, right? So transitional healthcare, in defining our terms, right, which is praxis, when I talk about transitional healthcare, I'm specifically talking about methods, procedures, and or what's the other word? It's stuff that falls under medical things that people do to transition, to physically change their bodies in one way or another. And I want to put a blanket disclaimer and say that you do not have to do any of these things to be trans. You do not have to experience dysphoria to be trans. This is not about gatekeeping. This is not about me saying, here's what you need to do to be trans. I don't believe in these things, all of them for everyone. You do what you have to do to be safe and happy with yourself. And I don't know if there are any detransitioners out there. We're going to talk probably a little bit about detransition, because detransition is a hot button issue thanks to that fucking Atlantic article that came out by the weird fetishy guy. So, all of that being said, this is based on work that I have done, and work that other people have done to talk about this issue, not as a way to police who and who is not trans, but as a way to think and talk about what can we learn from transition and transitional healthcare, especially about what the limits are for our healthcare institutions and healthcare policy, um, what are the limits that healthcare policy has on people's lives, but also the way that people interact with systems like the U.S. settler state, for example. That's what a lot of my work, all of my work, right, we've been over this, is pretty much U.S. based. I will talk briefly about Germany today, because it's sort of important to talk about Germany today. Not Germany today, like the present. I don't know anything about Germany in the present, but Germany in the 20s and 30s is important to talk about in this period, So, what is transitional healthcare as I'm using it? Transitional healthcare can mean hormone usage, right? Rourke, you're saying you want those hormones. I support you fully. Hope that the gatekeeping does not keep you down. Hormone usage can mean any number of cocktails of different levels of hormones and things to decrease certain hormones, right? So if you are a trans woman, you will take like a testosterone blocker, right? That's what Spiro is for. Spiro. I don't talk with other people about this very often. If you're a transmasculine person, you're probably, and you're seeking hormonal therapy, you'll probably describe some form of testosterone. Yes, those things often require a prescription. There are ways of doing it without a prescription that I can allude to, but don't actually have any contacts with. I can tell stories about trans women who used to get birth control, like regular run-of-the-mill, your sort of, your birth control that comes with estrogen and progesterone. And some trans women would make that sort of work for them. But I'm also talking, and this is kind of primarily what I'm talking about, even though there's a whole thing where, like, all we do is talk about surgery, and it's obsessive. We're, like, obsessed with surgery, and I find that exhausting. Most of the documentation and research about healthcare and about healthcare history and healthcare policy is rooted around surgery. I also want to say here, though, that there's like 100 surgeries you can get. Not 100, that's a lot, but even within like a procedure, we might call top surgery, there are different ways of approaching it. Surgeons have different ideas. When it gets to questions like bottom surgery, that can mean a whole gambit of things. There is There is not one single surgery that changes you from one gender to another. That's not how it works. That there is no one accepted surgery for things like changing your birth certificate or your ideas. Not your ideas, wow, changing your birth certificate or your IDs, any number of ID forms, right? Which some of those in certain states, like to change the sex on your driver's license, you might need a letter from a surgeon that says, I have performed a surgery on this person and their ID should be updated to reflect their gender. All of that varies state by state. There are a couple of maps online if you're really interested in finding out more. I think I'll talk about the maps, or I'll link them maybe later. So those are things, but there are also procedures like facial feminization surgery, electrolysis, what else can count as transitional healthcare? Therapy, right, is a form of transitional healthcare, and is one that is often super critical for getting access to all the other things, which we can talk about, the pathologization, right, of trans identity. Yeah, Rourke, I can look up stuff for folks who are in those states. It's way too much to know. I don't think there's any person that knows state by state regulations for everything. You're lucky if you can find people who know enough in your state, much less if you move. I just saw someone who asked a question about changing their ID and whether or not they needed to get their old birth certificate updated first. It's a nightmare. It's a bureaucratic nightmare, and it's supposed to be. Because that's how bureaucracy works. It's supposed to slow things down and make sure that they're done right. And also, yeah. Anyway, so we're going to talk today a lot about surgery. Surgery of different kinds, but most of them involving bottom surgery for trans women, whatever that means. And it means a lot of different things. I'm not interested so much in, how do I talk about this? So, yeah, no, things are really confusing, Brooke, and that's really interesting that you wouldn't need therapy to get hormones. Often that is, and here's the other thing, right? So, another piece of this is that there are what we call standards of care that are put out by the World Professional WP Association for Transgender Health. Yeah, something like that. That listing. WPATH is what it's called. And they set out a standards of care that's been released, I think, ever since transsexualism was in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that people use. Hi, Dan! It's so confusing. That people use to, that, like, mental health professionals use to diagnose and treat mental illness. It's their big, fat book of everything. Transsexualism was put in, I think, in the 80s, right after homosexuality was removed, which a lot of folks will point to and say is really significant. Eve Sedgwick, I think, has a whole essay where she basically says, look, we're just going to be and this is an essay from a long time ago, I think, from the Time. She says, look, we're just going to re-pathologize basically feminine boys and say, oh, they're not fags, they're trans people. I have not read that essay, so I have some, like, mixed feelings, because I have mixed feelings about Eve Sedgwick, period, but it's a really important thing to consider, right? The way that we're pathologizing gender, and the way that we've pathologized sexuality through the forms of gender presentation in the past, right? Because if you're a sort of, like, if you're a masked gay man, you're not going to be ID'd, right, and diagnosed with homosexuality unless you somehow are outed or out yourself through behavior, through, like, sexual behavior. But if you're, like, a little feminine boy, who also is gay, you're going to be, you know, they're going to pick you out and be like, oh, that one's gay, or, oh, that one's trans. So, yeah. Where was I going with this? Oh. So the standards of care, I think we're on our 5th edition and working on the 6th, or we could be on the 4th and working on the 5th. I don't know. I can't remember. I'm in some weird group that is was for the standards of care, and they have another group now because it's become this really weird thing. It's hilarious, by the way. If you are interested in sort of global news, but US focused, on transitional healthcare and just trans people in the news, you should join this group, because it's just like a wild mishmash of professionals from WPATH, therapists, and other healthcare professionals who want to provide certain kinds of care, mothers coming in asking for help for their children. Yeah, all of that is wild. Are we on the 5th edition, Dan? Did you Google it for me? I need a fact checker in here. So anyway, the standards of care set up specific things. They set up paths of treatment. And some of those paths in the past have been very restrictive. There used to be, for example, a requirement that before you could get surgery, before you could pursue surgical methods for your transitional health care, you would have to live as your new gender for, I think it was 3 to 5 years. It would be the WPATH standards of care, Dan, if you want to Google it so the chat can know what the hell's going on. So live as, meaning that you would socially transition and live full-time as your gender, meaning in your workplace, out to all of your friends, to your family, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Which is a bananas requirement. Because, why? What the hell is the point? It's a hugely long time work, right? Like, that's bananas. That is no longer in the standards of care that currently exist. They got rid of that because it's so bizarre and dumb. And yeah, being out at work is can be really dangerous, open a ton of horrible doors, bleh. Oh, apparently we're on version 7, Jesus, well, I'm behind, whatever. Thanks, Dan, for the Google. So yeah, fuck that specific requirement, but even though this requirement doesn't exist, there can be and are people who work on old versions of the standards of care. So you, as a trans person, can know this is not a requirement for me or suggested for me by the leading world transgender health organization. And you can come in contact with someone along the line who has a huge impact on your ability to proceed in your transition as you want to pursue it. And they can be like, no, you need to wait 3 to 5 years and live as your gender full time, which is bonkers. So all of that to say, the stuff, it's uneven. It's a mess. It's a nightmare to deal with transitional healthcare. Or it cannot be, right? So, my experience pursuing, for those of you who don't know, I think everyone in the chat knows, right? I had a bilateral mastectomy. Rourke, it's not a law thing, so it is legal, technically. I mean, you can go to your doctor and be like, hey, this isn't true and super shitty, but they can be like, well, sorry, and you can then name smear them in the trans health community, and that's, I think you could find some joy from that, but I don't know if that helps you. So anyway, yeah, I had a bilateral mastectomy, gosh, today's Sunday, fuck, a little under 2 weeks ago, and I am here, and I set my first appointment to ask a general practitioner about whether or not it was an option for me, a person who is not on hormones and has never been on hormones and has no desire to be on hormones, if that was allowed you know, by the law. WPATH standards say you don't have to. And healthcare organizations, some of them now will say you don't have to. So, like, my insurance covered my surgery even though I wasn't, even though I'm not on hormones. So that is, like, a whole other thing, is I found, you know, a way to pursue my personal transitional healthcare that was incredibly fast, like wildly fast. It took just over a calendar year, like to the week. I think it was like 1 week after 1 full year that I had talked to a GP, and 2, it was all paid for, to my knowledge. I have not yet received a bill for surgery, which is wild, right? And how are we at this point where it's so how are we at this point? It's called, American healthcare fucking sucks, but also, I will mention, British healthcare also fucking sucks, because they work on a way old version of the SOC that suck ass. Sorry folks from the UK, your healthcare is, I'm sure, fine for you, but sucks ass in that department. Yeah, so, I feel like I'm talking all over the place. How did we get here? How do we start doing these things? What is going on? How did it develop to this point today where it's so messy and so uneven? And the answer is, we've never regulated it. So, transitional healthcare, as you and I might understand it, starts kind of at the turn of the century. They're in Europe, right? So, turn of the 20th century. In 1912, I think. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes because I don't believe in knowing dates. In 1912, there's this sort of endocrinologist whose name is Eugene Steinach, and he was interested in what we might term male and female hormones, or like what higher levels of estrogen versus higher levels of testosterone would do. Because, for the record, right, we all know that everyone has testosterone and estrogen in their bodies, right? Like, I'm not on T, but I have testosterone in my body because we need them to live. But Eugene Steinach was like, I wonder what happens if you take ovaries from mice and put them in the ovaries of a mouse that has testes. Like, what would happen? So he was doing all this weird shit. Magnus Hirschfeld, who I'm sure you all, maybe you don't know, actually, that's not true. Magnus Hirschfeld is was a gay, trying to think, was he a psychologist? I don't know what his original field was, but basically was a big force for the legalization of homosexuality in Germany. I think he was a therapist. I think he worked in psychology or a related field. He gathered all these people around him because there were a lot of folks who, there's a lot of overlap, right? This is the overlap I'm talking about in gay and trans history, where you have this sort of man who's like, oh, homosexuality. But because those lines that we have between sort of a gay sexual identity or a same-sex sexual identity and sort of cross-gender behavior, or what we might call trans people, the line between those communities is super slippery and almost non-existent at this time. That's just what happens. So he was performing, or had people in contact through the Hirschfeld Institute, they were doing some transitional healthcare. This is, I think, where you get Lily Elbe, who is the second, not the first, woman to sort of have a surgical procedure done on her that looks to us today like a transitional surgery. There's a lot of backwards reading that happens. We can talk about that. Lily Elbe, I think eventually died she died from sepsis from was it a uterine transplant maybe? I could be wrong on that, but basically she was pretty clearly, like, to us, you know, she was trying to replace certain body parts that she was that she had at birth with body parts that we would typically associate with women. And so she sort of transitioned. It worked out for her. There was another woman in Germany. There were a couple others that we know about. There is the sort of like library of Alexandria panic because much of Hirschfeld's research and holdings were burned by the Nazis. So Lord only knows what we've lost, but also I'm not interested in sort of the fetishization of that because there's also a lot going on here about the pathologization of gay identity as a move to towards some level of safety that is kind of uncomfortable. So Hirschfeld gets sort of tossed around as this like great genius, but also the ways in which he's writing and talking are kind of uncomfortable. We don't talk about that because we're in this weird moment where we can't talk about these things. So it's messy, like literally every single thing in history. So we have, that is in the 30s, and Hirschfeld kind of gathers this like intellectual German, mostly German, some Austrian group. Also, by the way, apparently surgeries were being done in England. There's a reference to them. They were, for the record, mostly on trans women that we have records of. They mostly involved castration or ovary implantation. So they weren't focused on sort of genitals the way that we today associate sort of bottom surgery with genitals. Anyway, so in this group that Magnus Hirschfeld had around him, there was I think he's an endocrinologist, and his name is Harry Benjamin. And Harry Benjamin, if you know much about transitional healthcare, you know the name. WPATH used to be called the Harry Benjamin, like, organization for blah, 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 before they renamed it. So he's, like, a huge name in transitional healthcare, particularly in the US. It's because he moves from Germany in maybe the teens or 20s and moves to New York. He, but is in constant contact with Hirschfeld. He actually, one of the coolest things that I ever found in the archive, this was before I started doing this transitional work research, at the Newberry Library in Chicago, there used to be this club called the Dill Pickle Club, and it would have these like sort of lefty or progressive speakers come and talk, and it had Magnus Hirschfeld, who came from Germany to give a talk at the Dill Pickle Club about homosexuality. And that talk was organized by Harry Benjamin, who was based in New York. So I'm like flipping through this folder trying to find something, and I discovered that there's Harry Benjamin's business card in those holdings, which was really cool. So Harry Benjamin was first put in contact with a patient in the 1920s, a patient who wanted hormones. And that patient's name was, I wrote down Otto, and I didn't write down his last name because of who I am as a person. But now, yeah, there's no pickle connection for trans women. But this person in Benjamin's notes is noted as a transvestite. This person only wanted hormones, did not want surgery. There are only 100,000 different ways to think about maybe that's all they wanted. Maybe pursuing longer or a different kind of transition, it wasn't possible for them, blah, blah, blah. But that's in the 20s, right? So to also then think about the timeline of this, transitional healthcare, and particularly surgery, comes into the public eye hugely in the US in 1952. Which is when Christine Jorgensen had her surgery and then recovered from it and walked off a plane to a bunch of people taking pictures of her because her story either was leaked or may have been leaked by her, depending on who you listen to. So
But we have people who are pursuing transitional healthcare in the United States in the 1920s, right? So that timeline that people will tell you about, oh, trans people started in 1952 with Christine Jorgensen is fucking fake. So clearly, because she went abroad and someone was willing to perform this surgery. So whatever. Benjamin had another patient who was trying to get surgery. Her name was Val Berry. And I think Kinsey put her in contact with Benjamin, if I'm getting my story right. Alfred Kinsey, of course, of the Kinsey Reports, who is a noted American sexologist, discovered Val through a series of interviews, and connected her and Benjamin. She tried to get surgery in the US for a really long time, and it didn't work until after she ended up having to get surgery in Europe. But one of the really awesome things is that we have her letters to Benjamin. He did very early in his career, especially because he was sort of the person to talk to, and he would basically give you like advice and try to hook you up with doctors early in his career over like the mail. You would write to him and be like, hey, here's my situation, what can I do about it? And early on he would be like, well, if you can get your GP to give you some fucking hormones, here's the dosage you should take. And then later in his career he would be like, I can't tell you, you have to come. So that is interesting to think about in terms of gatekeeping, and also just like the change that we have. So those early years from like, the 20s through really 1962 were all done through private practice. And we don't have any record really of many folks being able to get transitional healthcare beyond hormones, because there's this thing in U.S. law called the Mayhem Statute, or the Maiming Statute, which is a statute that literally comes from England, Henry VIII. It's a statute that says that you can't get rid of, operate on, or remove a healthy body part. Did Harry Benjamin want the prestige? I can't talk to Harry Benjamin's there's a lot of like back and forth about Harry Benjamin was a piece of shit who invented gatekeeping, and Harry Benjamin was the saint of the trans community and gave everyone so much access, and we know all these things because of him today. And I would say it's somewhere probably in the middle. But yeah, no, the Maiming Statute comes from Henry VIII. It's literally, from my understanding, meant to prevent men who could be soldiers from like chopping off a limb. And this statute inexplicably is on the books in like a lot of states. And people who worked in transitional healthcare, or who worked with folks who wanted to transition through surgery, were like deeply afraid that they were going to be prosecuted under this statute, to the point where in 1962 there was the first university-based gender clinic or gender program at UCLA. But it's unclear what sort of healthcare they provided beyond therapy. It's unclear. They definitely did not do surgery, because everyone involved, including Alfred Kinsey and the governor and attorney general of California, were really worried that surgeons who do this could be prosecuted. So there theoretically was a legal barrier to transition. It is unclear whether or not that was, I have never heard of anyone being prosecuted by, under the Mayhem Statute for this, ever. And, I researched this for a living for a long time, and still keep up to date on it, so it's never worked out, but it was a legal concern. The first program but we're moving, right? This UCLA program that was developed sort of signaled this brand new moment in transitional healthcare history in the United States, which was the university program moment or movement. There was a program very shortly thereafter, I think 63, 64, 65, they were up and running, at Johns Hopkins that did offer surgery. However, you had to pay monies to be in this program, even though it was technically for research and they should have been paying you. And you had to then pay your own money for surgery. You had to pay what is in 2015, 16 US dollars, you had to pay $11,000 for your surgery. Some surgeries are as low as $7,000 now. So, and there was no insurance coverage. It just didn't, it wasn't on people's radars, and it didn't happen. So, right, there are a ton of barriers to getting particularly surgical procedures done as part of transition. People did it. Reed Erickson is a real wild character. That there's a podcast by a trans woman named Morgan Page called One from the Vaults, and she has a great episode on Reed Erickson, who was fucking wild. He was like a millionaire. He transitioned through this program, right? Paid his way, paid for the surgeries. He basically, any information that developed during that period where the Erickson, it's the EEF, I can't remember what the second E stands for, that his foundation did was, like, they were really into researching healthcare, but also they were super into researching crystals and, like, drugs and, like, hallucinogens. And so, just a very wild character. I strongly recommend, maybe I'll talk about Erickson in the future, but definitely go look up that One from the Vault episode about Erickson. He transitioned there. There were a couple of we have record of a few black women who transitioned through that Johns Hopkins clinic. But one of the other big signals from that clinic, one, it was super visible. I think there's a New York Times article about it opening. Two, it sparked off some other clinics, including one here in Minnesota at the University of Minnesota, whose gender clinic was free to all Minnesotans. So if you had residence here that you could prove, you could go through the clinic and your healthcare would be free. That changed in that moment, which is a super highly researched moment, because we have all this documentation and it's very centralized, right? You just have to go to the archives of a school and be like, hey, let's do this. The clinic at the University of Minnesota, as it existed, shut down in 1971. And a lot of that was because the clinic politically it shifted. So the clinic at Johns Hopkins got a change of head to a man whose name escapes me, but I don't care to say it anyway because he's a big bag of dicks and he's still out there saying that trans people should not be allowed to transition. Anyway, they changed heads and he basically closed the program down on the basis of, like, oh, this is not how trans people are mentally ill and we really shouldn't give in to their bizarre desires to be comfortable in their bodies. And so a bunch of these school programs shut down. Minnesota shut down in 71, but what we get from this, right, for the first time, in 1971, a woman from Minnesota who had been in the program, and who was on state welfare, basically filed a claim with the Minnesota State Medicaid program, with the state Medicaid program that said, hey, I need surgery to be able to live my life. my dysphoria is debilitating enough and is disabling enough, literally, that I need this surgery, and you're going to cover it. And the Medicaid claims at first were like, no. So she sued in 1972, basically in what, or it's unclear. They denied her claim at first, and she like not reapplied, but was like, hey, I'd like you to look at this again. And it went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme State Court. And the Minnesota State Supreme Court said, actually, you do have to cover this because you have no exception to it. Basically, like, you can't do a blanket exception for a kind of healthcare. And there was no maiming statute, so there was no law that they could fall back on and be like, actually, we can't legally. So this is groundbreaking, right? In 1972, we have a person who gets transitional surgery done, paid for by a state Medicaid program. That's wild. However, things are about to get real messy because other states start having to do this too. Wisconsin, who is Minnesota's neighbor, for those of you who maybe don't know U.S. geography, right next door, they had someone who applied, and they had to cover it as well. And this really pissed off people who were in charge of Medicaid programs. You have letters, all of this stuff you can find in the National Archives. I've looked at it personally, because this is what I do. They, of course, always here to provide geographic notes, Dan. But they basically wrote a letter to what is now the Secretary for the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. Which, is that getting closed down in the new era? I'm so confused. Government's bad. Wisconsin is the state we're talking about. And basically he was like, hey, we need you to do something and say something because this is garbage. How dare I pay for it? He really was mad on both levels. Health and Human Services, Dan. He was mad really that poor people were getting good health care. But also the fact that it's transitional surgery that's being covered. He says some garbage statement in this letter that's like, poor people are getting better health care on Medicaid than middle-class people on private insurance, which, like, maybe we should all be on Medicaid, motherfuckers. Just a thought. And at the time, the secretary was like, I can't fucking help you. It's a Medicaid issue, and your state government, your state court told you the answer to this problem. So, but he also at the same time sent a note to the organization that today, basically, it's called CMS, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but basically, they're in charge of healthcare financing. They used to be called the HCFA, Healthcare Financing Administration, and now they're the CMS. I don't know what that stands for, but and he was like, hey, can we, like, look into this? So the HCFA, in 1981, there was a sort of subgroup that no longer exists. It lasted for, like, literally 3 minutes. It was called the National Center for Healthcare Technology, and its role was to look at the usefulness, and, like, where it was at of different healthcare procedures and healthcare technologies. So they looked at, like, pacemakers and different, I don't know, ways of intubation or whatever, but they also looked at transitional healthcare. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, thank you, Rourke. You think I've, like, written them letters and asked for FOIA, I've, like, filed FOIA requests with them, and just, it's been a while since I've looked at this, really. But so anyway, in 1981, this report from the NCHCT, the National Center for Healthcare Technology, was released that declared at the end of it basically that surgery was experimental. And which, if we look at it, we've been doing surgeries for a really long time. What is experimental about these things? I have not been able to find the full text of the report. I filed a FOIA agreement or a FOIA request in 2015. They emailed me. Wow. They emailed me back basically and were like, "We can't find this," which is garbage because they had just used it in overturning its own decision, basically. But we know for a fact that the NCHCT got testimony of some kind from Janice Raymond, who is, I can't believe she's fucking still alive, who is a radical feminist, anti-sex, hi Sunarel, anti-sex worker still. That's the work she's most proud of is her anti-sex worker work. Her book was it's called The Transitional Empire. In it, she basically says trans women are wolves in sheep clothing. They rape the female form by existing, and that's just the start of the garbage. At some point, she's like, trans people experiment on bodies, and the Nazis did experiments, so trans people are Nazis? She's a fucking piece of shit, and I am so excited for her to die. It's gonna be great. I'm gonna be so hype. So, after the NCHCT report came out, HHS was basically like, yeah, no, it's experimental, we're not gonna cover it. And this had already kind of been done. I think in Georgia, they were like, well, if you call it experimental, you don't have to cover it. So that basically becomes the policy across the board for Medicaid. She's basically a Star Trek villain, right? They fight bigotry in Star Trek. I learned that word from Star Trek. So basically, my point being on that report, though, is that I don't know and cannot say who else they talked to. It's unclear. I haven't done as thorough, maybe a dig through the Harry Benjamin papers. I don't know who else they spoke to. But within the trans community, basically, Janice Raymond has taken the full fall for a loss of coverage and therefore a huge loss of access, particularly for poor trans people in healthcare. I cannot say... I don't feel comfortable as a historian saying that that's wholly true. I can tell you it didn't fucking help. But I don't know who else they spoke to. And it seems like we won't have that information until someone does their fucking job at the FOIA department. I'm a little bitter that I filed that request and it didn't happen. So, that's on me. But, so basically, private insurance companies could take their cues from public insurance companies, right? From Medicare and Medicaid. And that's what they did. And that is why many companies do not cover transitional healthcare still. Some do. A lot of larger providers do. My provider does. Maybe your provider does. If you're on a private insurance program. And more are starting to cover. A lot of that was because in 2014, there was a turnover on that decision. It was what is the word I'm thinking for? Not re-examined. Yeah, I guess re-examined. Or someone basically was like, hey, it's been fucking 25 years since 1981. Maybe this isn't experimental anymore. And the DAB, which is the Departmental Appeals Board, who kind of decides these things, was like, yeah, and also it wasn't like relitigated the O'Rourke because it really wasn't suing. Just someone basically was just like, let's re-examine this, please, because I would like to get coverage. And the DAB basically was like, not only is it not experimental now, it probably shouldn't have been experimental in 1981. And so Medicare now has to cover it. I don't know that that's still true. I stopped studying healthcare and started studying death basically the minute Donald Trump was elected president. So I have not stayed as on top of that maybe as I should have. I don't know if Medicare covers it. It's often a bitch to get it covered, even if it does cover it, depending on your access. But that is, that's where we're at today. Some state Medicaid, I know Oregon, it was like a huge deal when Oregon said that their Medicaid was going to cover it. I don't know what other states, what their positions are on covering it. Massachusetts sounds like it might, because they're kind of pushing a lot of boundaries. I think Massachusetts state, it sounds, Rourke, like the state is moving towards a patient, I don't know what that's called, like patient-guided model. But that's sort of the history of transitional healthcare in the U.S. It's a fucking nightmare mess, except if you are me and have enough privileges and experience with bureaucracy that you can get your surgery done in less than a year. And also, if you're over 18, I do want to address for a hot second the Atlantic article, although there was a great follow-up by a trans woman who she herself detransitioned and then transitioned sort of again. So go look that up. But I want to talk briefly about what transitional healthcare looks like for children and teenagers, because there is this sort of panic struck by the article that says, well, what if they just don't, that's basically the article. But the crux of that argument is, what if children don't know what they want and they grow out of it? What if it's a phase? Is the core anxiety of that article and of most of the people that he interviewed. And the answer to that is no surgeon, in almost no case, will perform surgery on a trans person under the age of 18. There are a handful of cases, all of them I think in Europe. I know there, I think, was a young Swedish girl who was maybe 14 when she got surgery. That, I guarantee, I don't know the details of that case, but I guarantee you it was because it was exceptional and probably was a life or death moment for that girl. And so her healthcare team made a choice about saving her life. Because that's what we miss in this, right? Is that this healthcare is deeply politicized, but is also life or death for many people. It isn't for everyone. I probably could have lived a couple more years the way I was living. It would have sucked. Like, I'll tell you right here, if there's any trans mask folks in the chat, don't bind for like 12 hours a day. I know you feel like you have to live, but also you're fucking up your back, and that's just how it is. And I can say that now because I'm on the other side and don't have to bind ever again, theoretically. But, yeah. So, what does transition look like for children? For very small children, because, right, there are some trans kids who are 2 and 3 years old and are already saying, this is how I feel and who I am. Transition for them looks only like social transition. I had my surgery like almost 2 weeks ago, Sunneral, so I'm free, sort of. I'm in an ace bandage and it fucking sucks. Transition, that's my favorite thing also about, like, seeing little trans kids, is you don't know what gender they're supposed to be, because all children have no gender, and it's very fake, and children should be children. Oh, no worries, Sunneral. I knew you were thinking of me, and that I got tons of support from everyone. So yeah, by the way, while I'm here on this platform, thank you to everyone who supported me during that time, who said really nice things to me on Twitter, who continue to support me as I continue to recover. You're amazing, and that support means the whole world to me, so thank you. Anyway, children, yes. Children, little kids, no medical transition whatsoever. Probably you will take a child to a therapist because you yourself don't know what to do. But the studies, of which there are not many, say that the best thing you can do for your very small trans child is support them, let them do what they want with their gender, let them wear whatever clothes they want, just let them be, and if it's a phase, like, oh well, and if it's not a phase, you've supported your kid, so either way, good job parenting. With trans sort of preteens and teenagers, it gets a little more complicated, mostly because the lines of when people are, yeah, Rourke, like, little trans kids are so fun. Oh, I love little trans kids. I love all trans people, but little kids bring me a lot of joy because they're very funny. Yeah, so the thing about that is it's a question, right, of whether or not to put kids on hormones, and that's a choice that should be made by every family, every kid themselves, and doctors. They shouldn't be made by fucking randos who fetishize trans women and then write articles about garbage. So, one thing that weirdly the article doesn't talk about, and yet seems to be suggesting, which is also a huge divisive thing, is whether or not kids should go on puberty blockers, which are, it's a medical intervention basically that blocks the sort of normal set-off of increased levels of testosterone and or estrogen that we see associated with certain genders. And you can block that for a period of time and basically give the kids some time to think and time to figure out who they are and if they want to pursue transitional healthcare or if they're okay with undergoing puberty associated with the gender they were assigned at birth. And that is for some reason really controversial, even though to me it seems like the smartest thing, and frankly every person should be put on fucking puberty blockers because I would have liked that. Because puberty can be super traumatic for trans people. Mine was, I think puberty is traumatic for everyone, but I think it's also traumatic specifically in increased ways for trans people. So, I've kind of rambled at you for literally almost an hour. Do you guys have any questions for me about transitional healthcare, its history, or my experience navigating transitional healthcare? State-by-state questions about your own healthcare, I can Google for you later if you want. I do have experience navigating bureaucracies, so if you are looking to seek out certain things, let me know, and I can see what my networks come up with. Brooke, I've never had a question either. I don't believe in questions. So, also I want you all to, if you're interested, an article just came out by Gwen Benaway, who's a Métis trans woman two-spirit writer. I can retweet it. She just wrote, she had a vaginoplasty not that long ago, like within the last year maybe, and she wrote an article about it, and wrote another article that was specifically about the first time she had sex after her surgery. That it's a really beautiful article, and I can't recommend it highly enough. But if there's no questions, then we can honestly, it's like almost 5 o'clock here, which means it's 6 o'clock for East Coast folks and other times for other people. Just love. Okay, it's 5 o'clock here, crew, so I think I'm going to let you all go off to dinner or other activities. Thank you so much for hanging out. I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions, you can always hit me up on Twitter at @yetregressing. You know where to find me. But this was really fun for me, so thank you so much. Goodbye!